Imagine a world where the sun itself seems to betray humanity. The year is 536 AD, and for the first time in living memory, the sky turns pale and sickly, casting a ghostly twilight across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Some researchers believe a massive volcanic eruption in the northern hemisphere had hurled an unimaginable quantity of ash into the atmosphere, blotting out sunlight for months, maybe even years. Others suggest multiple eruptions, or perhaps a cosmic event, though the evidence remains tantalizingly incomplete. Witnesses wrote of dimmed light, where noon felt like dusk, and crops failed as the sun's warmth vanished from the fields. Farmers stared in horror at wilted plants and empty granaries, as livestock weakened and entire communities faced starvation. Chroniclers of the time, like Byzantine historian Procopius, recorded a world suddenly stripped of color, where rivers and forests seemed muted, and the air carried an unnatural chill. Seas appeared more turbulent, winds biting sharper, and the very rhythms of life of planting, harvesting, and feasting were thrown into disarray. Entire economies faltered, trade routes slowed, and the familiar hum of civilization grew quieter, more desperate. Scholars today estimate that temperatures dropped by several degrees, a dramatic shift that triggered crop failures not just for one season, but for years, echoing across continents. The sheer scale of the event is almost unimaginable. Societies that had thrived for centuries teetered on the brink of collapse. People, bewildered by the sun's strange behavior, interpreted omens, blamed celestial forces, or whispered that the end times were near. Imagine standing in a marketplace under a sky so dim you can barely see your neighbor's face, feeling the chill creep into your bones, and realizing that tomorrow might bring even less light, less warmth, less life. In 536 AD, darkness was more than metaphor. It was tangible, suffocating, and unrelenting. And yet, even in this shadowed world, humanity endured. The mysteries of why the sun vanished, of how temperatures dropped so catastrophically, still echo in the sediment layers and ice cores scientists study today. From one muted sky to the next, the year 536 left a mark that historians, climatologists, and archaeologists can still trace, a silent warning of nature's immense power over human fate. And as we move forward, the question lingers. What happened in that year that would be remembered as the beginning of one of the darkest centuries in human history? As the pall of darkness lingered over the earth, the subtle horrors of 536 AD began to take shape in the most primal way. Hunger. Crops that depended on the sun's warmth withered in fields and orchards. Grains shriveled, fruits rotted before ripening, and pastures, once lush and green, turned brittle and grey. Some researchers suggest that temperatures dropped by as much as 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, a catastrophic shift for agrarian societies dependent on delicate seasonal cycles. Europe, already fractured by political instability, faced its first waves of famine. Families abandoned villages in desperate search of food, leaving behind homes half filled with the ghosts of meals never eaten. In the Mediterranean, olive trees produced almost nothing, and vineyards failed, leaving communities without essential staples of their diets. Livestock weakened from lack of fodder, and diseases spread rapidly among starving populations, compounding the misery. Chroniclers like Michael the Syrian recorded that bread became so scarce that people resorted to eating grass and leaves, while others reported outbreaks of cannibalism in isolated regions. Far to the east, in China and Central Asia, droughts coincided with the global temperature drop, leaving riverbeds cracked and irrigation canals empty. Famine was not merely a scarcity of food. It became a social force, reshaping entire societies. Tribes and cities fought over what little remained, while families fractured under the strain of survival. Trade routes slowed as scarcity and insecurity forced caravans to abandon journeys, cutting off the flow of grain, salt, and other essentials. The ripple effects were felt in governance and politics. Rulers faced riots. Tax revenues plummeted, and armies weakened as soldiers went hungry. Even the Roman Empire's successor states struggled to cope, their bureaucracies ill-prepared for the scale of the crisis. And yet, amidst the desperation, the human will to endure flickered stubbornly. Some communities learned to adapt, storing what little could be salvaged, while others migrated en masse, leaving traces of abandoned settlements that archaeologists still uncover today. The famine of 536 AD was not a singular event, but a prologue to decades of hardship. Scholars link it to the wider climatic anomaly known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which would grip the world for more than a century. It was a hunger that stretched beyond borders, a reminder that human societies, no matter how advanced, are fragile in the face of nature's sudden wrath. And as famine tightened its grip, another threat loomed silently, waiting to turn despair into catastrophe: disease, as the world staggered under the weight of famine and relentless cold. An invisible predator began its work, creeping along trade routes, rivers, and cities, the first ominous whispers of what would later be called the Plague of Justinian. Some researchers believed the disease was a form of bubonic plague, carried by rats and fleas, spreading with terrifying efficiency across the Mediterranean and into Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The stench of death became as familiar as the bitter taste of famine. Entire households vanished overnight, leaving homes eerily silent except for the rustle of wind through abandoned streets. Chroniclers describe streets strewn with corpses and marketplaces emptied not just by hunger but by fear of contagion. The plague did not discriminate. Peasants and nobles alike succumbed. Doctors and clergy fell alongside merchants and soldiers, and the fabric of society began to fray. Some villages lost more than half of their population, others disappeared entirely, swallowed by sickness and despair. Ports and trade hubs slowed to a crawl as merchants abandoned ships and caravans, cutting off the fragile arteries of commerce that had once bound the empire together. The psychological toll was immense. People believed the heavens had turned against them. Rumors spread of divine punishment, of wrathful gods or spirits angered by human sin. Some communities burned homes of the infected in desperation. Others fled into forests, hoping isolation could shield them. And yet the disease was not merely a physical threat, it reshaped political and military landscapes. Armies weakened, unable to feed or protect themselves, leaving borders exposed and cities vulnerable. The Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Justinian, struggled to maintain authority, as local leaders, overburdened and terrorized, often abandoned posts or hoarded resources. Across the broader European continent, famine and plague combined to create waves of migration, with desperate families seeking food, safety, or refuge in regions already stretched thin. Archaeological evidence shows mass graves appearing across Italy, the Levant, and Gaul during this period, silent testimony to the scale of the disaster. And yet, amidst this horror, life persisted in strange and stubborn ways. Some communities adapted, isolating themselves, rationing food, or developing crude medical practices to slow the spread. Others believed in charms, prayers, or rituals to ward off death, blending superstition with survival instinct. The plague of 536 AD was not a single event, but the first of many that would strike the world over the next decades. A silent companion to the darkness, amplifying famine and fear. It left scars that no map could fully capture. A testament to the fragility of human civilization when nature and disease converge. And as the shadow of death stretched over Europe and the Mediterranean, another element of this dark year was silently reshaping the sky itself, adding a layer of cosmic dread to the unfolding catastrophe. Imagine looking up at the sky and seeing the sun reduced to a dim, ghostly orb, its light weak and reddish, barely reaching the earth. In 536 AD, witnesses across the globe described such a scene. Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia experienced an unusual, persistent darkness that lasted for months. Some chroniclers wrote of a mysterious cloud that blotted out the sun, turning day into a twilight that chilled the earth and withered crops. Trees withered, rivers froze earlier, and the air carried a strange, acrid smell, hinting at distant fires or volcanic activity. Modern researchers now suspect that a massive volcanic eruption, or possibly a series of eruptions, ejected ash and aerosols high into the stratosphere, spreading across continents and dimming sunlight for years. The scale was immense, so large that it altered climate patterns across hemispheres. Summer temperatures plummeted, causing the once predictable rhythm of agriculture to fail. Crops rotted in fields or produced meager yields. Grain prices skyrocketed, and famine spread like wildfire. Chroniclers of the time described frost in midsummer, ice forming on rivers in places that had never seen it before, and snow falling far beyond its usual season. People reported seeing a shadow on the sun and felt a pervasive gloom that seemed almost supernatural. Some historians suggest that this sky darkening fueled religious fervor and apocalyptic fear, as communities interpreted the dimmed sun as a divine warning. Artifacts and inscriptions hint at a world convinced that the end of days might be upon them. Livelihoods and economies collapsed under the weight of poor harvests. Empires struggled to feed their populations, and political instability intensified. Historians also note unusual migrations and conflicts, possibly driven by desperation and scarcity, as people competed for dwindling resources. This phenomenon did not just challenge survival, shook the very foundations of perception. Imagine entire societies trying to navigate months of near darkness, uncertainty, and despair, while disease and famine already gnawed at their lives. Scientists today study ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, finding evidence of sulfate deposits from volcanic activity that confirm the extraordinary scale of this climatic event. Some researchers even suggest that multiple eruptions across different regions compounded the effect, creating a perfect storm of darkness and cold. For the ordinary person in 536 AD, there was no science to explain why the sun had failed them, why warmth had vanished, or why life had suddenly become precarious. And yet, while humanity struggled to comprehend these skies, the world below was being reshaped in ways few could anticipate. For the hungry, sick, and fearful, every day became a battle under a shadowed sun, a battle that would only intensify in the years to come. Next, we move from the darkened skies to the famine that gripped the land, a slow-motion catastrophe that would leave millions on the brink of starvation, beneath the dimmed sun and the ashen sky. The world of 536 AD began to starve. Fields that should have shimmered with golden grain lay withered and stunted, their once fertile soil turned brittle and cold. Chroniclers speak of harvests failing across Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. Barley, wheat, and rye barely grew, and livestock struggled to find grazing as frost lingered into the traditional growing season. Grain prices soared beyond reach, forcing families to ration what little remained, and in some regions, people were reported eating roots, bark, and even grass to survive. Some researchers believe that famine claimed up to half the population in certain areas over the following years, though precise numbers remain uncertain. Starvation drove desperation, fueling migrations as communities abandoned villages in search of food, leaving behind empty homes, fields, and animals. Archaeological evidence hints at malnourishment and disease spreading in tandem, weakening societies already burdened by political instability. In Constantinople, a chronicler noted the great scarcity that left citizens famished, while in Ireland and Britain, reports speak of failed crops and rising mortality. The famine was not merely a natural disaster. It became a catalyst for social and political upheaval. Leaders struggled to maintain order as people raided granaries, bartered valuables for bread, and in some cases, abandoned local authority entirely. The combined effect of cold, darkness, and scarcity created a palpable despair, where communities felt abandoned by both gods and rulers. Beyond immediate hunger, the famine weakened immunity, making populations more susceptible to disease, creating the perfect conditions for epidemics to emerge in the years that followed. Scholars suggest that the climatic shock of 536 may have triggered a cascade of ecological failures. Pests, mold, and crop disease further diminished food availability, while shortages intensified competition over fertile land. It's difficult to overstate the psychological weight of famine under a shadowed sun. Imagine months where every day brought the gnawing certainty of hunger, where children grew thin and weak, and where even the elderly could not find sustenance. Desperation reshaped human behavior, families fractured, communities dispersed, and the stability of kingdoms faltered. And yet, amid the famine, the human will to survive persisted. Some regions adapted with ingenious measures, storing what little grain remained, diversifying crops, or moving livestock to better pastures. Others, tragically, succumbed entirely, leaving behind a stark reminder of nature's merciless power. While the famine raged, the world had no explanation for the dimmed sun or frozen summer. All anyone could do was endure, watch the seasons fail, and pray. And as the food ran out, so too did the illusions of safety, setting the stage for a deadly companion that would follow: disease. Next, we explore the arrival of the Justinian plague, a shadow that would claim millions and reshape the world in the decades to come, as famine gnawed at the world. A far deadlier shadow emerged from the east, invisible yet unstoppable: the Justinian plague, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from Constantinople. This pandemic would come to define the second half of the 6th century, claiming tens of millions of lives and leaving entire cities hollowed out. Contemporary accounts describe it with chilling detail: buboes swelling in the groin and armpits, high fevers, vomiting, and a blackening of the skin, a macabre signature of its virulence. Some researchers suggest it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen responsible for the Black Death nearly 900 years later, though others argue its precise origins may never be fully known. The plague struck trade hubs first, cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch, where merchants, sailors, and travelers unwittingly carried the disease along roads, rivers, and seas. Ships arriving with infected rats and fleas became floating vectors, seeding infection across continents. Entire neighborhoods reportedly emptied within weeks, leaving the stench of death lingering in alleys and marketplaces. In Constantinople, historians noted bodies piled in streets faster than burial could occur, and the dead were sometimes left exposed, a grim warning of mortality's sudden cruelty. The plague did not discriminate, striking rich and poor, soldier and civilian, noble and peasant alike. Political institutions faltered as administrators succumbed. Armies weakened as soldiers perished, and trade networks collapsed, amplifying famine and destabilizing economies already reeling from the mysterious dark sun of 536. Some suggest that this plague killed up to half of the empire's population, though exact numbers remain debated, lost to time and exaggeration. Social and religious responses were equally dramatic. People turned to prayer, processions, and rituals, desperate to appease a deity seemingly indifferent to human suffering. Others sought scapegoats, blaming outsiders, heretics, or even celestial wrath. The combination of famine, darkness, and plague created a world suspended in dread, a reality where survival itself felt miraculous. Scholars today argue that the plague reshaped geopolitics, contributing to the decline of the Byzantine military, opening territories to invasion and slowing economic recovery for decades. Communities that survived were forever altered, memory of death etched into their culture, religion, and art. And yet, amidst this devastation, human resilience persisted. Some villagers isolated themselves. Others adapted hygiene and burial practices, and trade slowly resumed along safer routes. But the scars were permanent. The Justinian plague was not a single event, but a series of waves that ebbed and flowed across continents for decades. A lingering reminder that the world of 536 AD had changed irreversibly. And while humanity struggled to comprehend the scale of death, the darkened sun, the famine, and now the plague, whispers of the unknown spread. Could this be nature's vengeance, cosmic misfortune, or a harbinger of even darker times ahead? Next, we examine the mysterious volcanic forces that may have triggered this unrelenting catastrophe, casting shadows across the sky and humanity alike. Imagine looking up and seeing the sun struggle to rise, its light muted, an ashen veil draped across the heavens. This was the reality in 536 AD, a year that would be etched into history as one of the darkest on record. For over a year, the sun's brilliance was dimmed, casting a cold, eerie twilight over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Crops failed, rivers froze, and famine tightened its grip on already weakened populations. Scholars and scientists have spent centuries trying to understand the cause of this inexplicable gloom, and the evidence points to a series of massive volcanic eruptions. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica reveal extraordinary layers of sulfate deposits, suggesting that colossal eruptions spewed dust and ash high into the stratosphere, creating a global sunshade that blocked warmth and disrupted weather patterns. Some researchers believe one eruption may have occurred in Iceland, while others point to North America or Central Asia as possible origins. The truth is shrouded in the same shadow that covered the Earth, leaving us with clues but no certainty. Contemporaries interpreted the phenomenon through the lens of religion and superstition. Chronicles from Constantinople describe the sun like the moon and skies, as if night had fallen. In China, records speak of frost in midsummer and failed harvests. Some theologians suggested it was divine wrath, a warning to humanity for its sins, while others feared the end of the world was near. The dimmed sun had cascading effects on daily life. Temperatures dropped dramatically, and even the simplest tasks became burdensome. Fields that should have yielded grain lay barren. Livestock perished from cold and hunger. Rivers froze that normally flowed freely. The combination of famine, disease, and darkness created an environment of despair so profound that some writers suggest entire communities vanished, swallowed by circumstance and fear. Beyond the immediate suffering, the environmental upheaval had long-term geopolitical consequences. Armies struggled to march in unseasonably harsh winters. Trade faltered as transport routes froze or were abandoned, and political leaders faced unrest from starving populations. The veil across the sky was not just a meteorological event, it was a psychological one, an omnipresent reminder of human fragility and nature's unpredictable cruelty. And while volcanic ash eventually settled and the sun returned, the memory of that shadow lingered, a harbinger of the broader calamities yet to strike in 536 AD. Next, we explore how the famine, compounded by darkness and plague, tore through civilizations, leaving empires vulnerable and reshaping the course of history in ways few could have anticipated. As the ashen skies of 536 AD persisted, the world beneath them began to unravel in ways that were both immediate and insidious. Crops failed across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, leaving granaries empty and fields barren. What had once been fertile land became a patchwork of withered stalks and frozen soil, a silent testament to nature's sudden cruelty. Famine arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, grinding force that gnawed at communities day by day. Some chroniclers describe bread that turned to dust, barley so thin it barely fed a child, and prices of staples skyrocketing beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. People resorted to desperate measures, eating tree bark, grass, even the remnants of stored seeds meant for the next planting season. Livestock, starved and weakened, perished in staggering numbers, depriving communities of both meat and labor, and rivers once teeming with fish ran dry or froze over, cutting off another vital source of sustenance. The psychological impact of this persistent hunger was profound. Families abandoned villages in search of food, wandering through a landscape that seemed cursed and unrecognizable. Social structures, already strained by environmental pressures, began to fracture. Theft, violence, and even cannibalism were recorded in some regions. Desperate acts of survival driven by a world stripped of its usual bounty. But famine was not uniform. It hit some regions harder than others, depending on local climate, soil, and previous harvests. In the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople faced severe food shortages that tested the resilience of its people and the capacity of its rulers. In the rural heartlands, communities simply disappeared, swallowed by hunger and disease. Scholars today suggest that this year of famine was part of a longer climate event that lasted more than a decade, weakening populations and making them vulnerable to subsequent disasters. Disease, particularly plague, found fertile ground in these weakened communities. Malnutrition lowered resistance, turning minor infections into deadly threats, and giving rise to waves of mortality that would echo for years. The combination of darkness, famine, and disease created a feedback loop of despair, one that transformed the very fabric of society. Ordinary people bore the brunt, but the elites were not immune. Trade routes faltered, armies struggled to feed themselves, and empires faced unrest from the starving masses. The slow hunger of 536 AD was not just physical, it was a cultural and political shockwave, reshaping the world's power dynamics, weakening empires, and setting the stage for events that would define the course of history. Next, we will examine the disease that struck in the aftermath, a plague that turned famine into catastrophe and further darkened this already grim chapter of human history. As famine ravaged the lands and the skies remained shrouded in a ghostly haze, another spectre began to creep across the empire: disease. In 541 AD, only a few years after the catastrophic events of 536, the plague of Justinian emerged, named after the Byzantine emperor who ruled from Constantinople. Unlike the slow gnaw of hunger, this disease moved with terrifying speed, invisible yet deadly, striking fear into the hearts of city dwellers and rural peasants alike. Chroniclers describe bodies piled in streets, the air thick with the stench of decay, and entire neighborhoods abandoned as infection raced through the population. Some historians estimate that Constantinople alone may have lost tens of thousands in the first outbreak, while across Europe the death toll mounted steadily, further weakened by years of famine. Symptoms were gruesome: high fevers, chills, swollen lymph nodes, buboes, and the rapid deterioration of the body in a matter of days. The plague did not discriminate. Rich and poor alike succumbed, though crowded urban centers magnified its lethality. Trade routes, once the arteries of empire, became conduits of contagion, spreading the disease from port to port, from Mediterranean shores to the interior of Europe and North Africa. The social and political consequences were immediate. Armies, already struggling with food shortages, found their ranks decimated. Tax revenues fell as cities emptied and commerce stalled. Even religious institutions faltered under the strain of caring for the sick while mourning their own dead. The psychological toll was immense. People interpreted the plague as divine wrath, a punishment for sins or a cosmic alignment of catastrophe following the sun's dimming, and the famine that had left the earth barren. Some communities abandoned the dead in mass graves. Others attempted quarantine measures, a primitive but desperate effort to slow the inexorable advance of the disease. Modern researchers, through DNA analysis of ancient remains, have confirmed that Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death centuries later, caused the plague of Justinian. Yet, in 536 to 541, no one understood germs or transmission. Survival depended on luck, proximity to the infected, and the resilience of a body already weakened by starvation. The plague did not end with a single wave. It recurred in cycles for decades, shaping the political and demographic landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean. Entire villages vanished. Population shrank by as much as 50% in some regions, and empires struggled to maintain cohesion. In many ways, the plague of Justinian transformed the world more thoroughly than any single battle or invasion. From one catastrophe to the next, humanity faced an unrelenting series of challenges. Next, we will explore how these disasters, the darkness, the famine, and the plague intertwined to produce waves of migration, social upheaval, and the reshaping of kingdoms across Europe and the Near East. As famine gnawed at the lands and the plague of Justinian continued its relentless sweep, entire communities found themselves on the move, driven by desperation, fear, and the instinct to survive. From the frozen forests of Scandinavia to the scorched fields of the Mediterranean, people abandoned homes that no longer yielded food. Villages emptied, and once thriving towns became ghostly shells. Chroniclers of the time describe streams of refugees moving along ancient roads, their faces gaunt, their clothes tattered, carrying what little they could salvage, children clinging to their parents, elders leaning on staffs worn smooth from travel. This mass migration was not random. It followed rivers, coastlines, and the ancient arteries of trade. Yet it also collided with established settlements, creating tensions and sporadic violence. Empires, already weakened by famine and plague, struggled to respond. Armies could not maintain order, local authorities were overwhelmed, and borders became porous. In some regions, the influx of starving migrants sparked small-scale uprisings, banditry, and the breakdown of traditional social structures. Some researchers believe that this period of movement laid the groundwork for larger population shifts in later centuries, influencing the eventual rise of new kingdoms in Western Europe and the reshaping of the Byzantine world. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, refugees fleeing the plague and food shortages carried with them knowledge, skills, and cultural practices that would subtly transform their new homes. Grain shortages led to barter systems, improvisational economies, and the rise of local leaders who could organize relief in ways distant emperors could not. The psychological impact was profound. Communities that had been rooted for generations found themselves dislocated, trust frayed, and old hierarchies questioned. Folk tales, songs, and chronicles from the time reflect this uneased visions of wandering families, spectral figures in the mist, and entire villages swallowed by the land, leaving only the faintest traces of life behind. Some historians suggest that the movement of peoples during this era sowed the seeds for the eventual migrations of Germanic tribes, Slavs, and other groups, events that would redefine Europe in the centuries to come. But even as people moved, they carried fear with them, the fear of famine, disease, and the unknown. The land itself seemed cursed. Fields that had once fed generations lay fallow, rivers shifted courses, and the memory of a sunless sky haunted those who survived. From this chaos emerged not only hardship, but adaptation, resilience, and the slow, invisible reshaping of human societies. Next, we turn to the economic collapse that accompanied these migrations. A world where coins lost value, trade faltered, and the structures of commerce that had supported empires teetered on the brink of ruin. As the sun dimmed and the plague spread, the world of 536 AD saw its carefully balanced economies crumble like sandcastles before the tide. Grain shipments faltered, river traffic slowed, and once bustling markets fell eerily silent. Merchants, who had relied on predictable harvests and the stability of empires, now faced uncertainty on every side. Crops failed, coins lost their value, and the fear of disease made travel perilous. In Constantinople, the great markets once echoing with the clash of bronze coins and the calls of traders, recorded shortages so severe that bread became a luxury and prices soared beyond the reach of common citizens. The Mediterranean trade network, the lifeblood of empires for centuries, fractured under pressure. Ships that once sailed laden with olive oil, wine, and grain now returned empty or not at all, their crews decimated by sickness or forced to abandon ports choked with famine-stricken populations. Rural communities fared no better. Farmers, facing failed harvests and the spectre of starvation, abandoned fields, leaving fertile land to weeds and wild animals. Local economies disintegrated, replaced by barter and improvised exchanges. where a goat might be traded for a sack of grain or a handful of silver. Some researchers suggest that this period of economic stagnation contributed directly to the weakening of the Byzantine treasury, leaving emperors with fewer resources to pay soldiers or maintain infrastructure. Cities became enclaves of desperation. Urban centers that had relied on imported food saw riots, looting, and a creeping sense of lawlessness. Meanwhile, artisans and craftsmen found their livelihoods threatened, as luxury items and specialized goods no longer found buyers in a world preoccupied with survival. The psychological impact was subtle but profound. Confidence in rulers waned, trust in trade networks evaporated, and the sense that the world had shifted permanently took hold in collective memory. Coins minted before the crisis became relics, symbols of a stability that no longer existed, while new, devalued currency circulated in a haze of uncertainty. Some argue that the economic dislocation of 536 AD set the stage for the decline of classical urban centers in the West, and contributed to the broader transformation of Europe into a patchwork of smaller, localized economies. Beyond numbers and ledgers, the collapse reshaped daily life. Scarcity dictated choices, fear dictated movement, and survival dictated alliances. Families huddled around dwindling fires, trading stories for warmth, planning each day with meticulous caution, aware that a single misstep could mean death. Yet even in this unraveling, human ingenuity flickered. Markets adapted, new networks formed, and local leaders emerged to fill voids left by empires. The world teetered between ruin and resilience. Next, we delve into the shadow of the plague of Justinian itself, exploring how its invisible hands swept through cities and villages, leaving mortality and terror in its wake, shaping societies forever. Amid the suffocating gloom of 536 AD, another invisible force was preparing to strike a scourge that would haunt the Mediterranean world for decades: the plague of Justinian. Named after the emperor who ruled from Constantinople, this was no ordinary outbreak of disease. It was a pestilence that moved like a shadow, creeping into cities, villages, and trade routes with a silence as deadly as the dimmed sun above. Ships arriving from distant ports carried more than grain and goods. They carried fleas and rats, the microscopic heralds of death. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, became a labyrinth of fear. Streets once bustling with merchants, laborers, and scholars were now lined with the sick and dying. Households barricaded doors against neighbors, fearing the touch of a relative might carry the fatal contagion. Historians estimate that the plague claimed tens of thousands in the city alone, though exact numbers are lost to time, swallowed by chaos and the collapse of record-keeping. Beyond Constantinople, the disease spread with the speed of commerce. Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, saw entire villages emptied overnight, fields left untended, granaries left to rot. In Italy, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, reports of mass deaths became commonplace, families extinguished in a single night, churches overwhelmed with the dying, and priests scrambling to perform rites for those who would not see mourning. The plague was merciless in its randomness. Emperors and peasants, soldiers and scholars, all fell victim with equal disregard. Some researchers believe that the rapid mortality disrupted armies and weakened imperial defenses, leaving borders vulnerable to invaders who had once been kept at bay. Markets collapsed further as fear of contagion prevented trade, and famine compounded the suffering, turning scarcity into desperation. Social structures strained, and cracked neighbor turned against neighbor, and superstition flourished. Some thought it divine punishment, others whispered of curses, and still others sought scapegoats among minorities or foreigners. The psychological weight was immense: fear of the unseen enemy, uncertainty of survival, and the haunting knowledge that the sun itself no longer burned with the same life-giving intensity. In a world already grappling with economic collapse and failed harvests, the plague transformed fear into a daily companion, reshaping society and altering the trajectory of empires. The very fabric of human civilization seemed to fray under the combined weight of famine, disease, and darkness. And yet, even in this maelstrom, life persisted, communities adapted, survivors moved, and the empire endured, though forever changed. Next, we explore how these intertwined catastrophes, plague, and political instability set the stage for a transformation of power and the collapse of Western cities, leaving echoes that would be felt for centuries to come. Just as famine tightened its grip across the continents, a far deadlier force emerged, invisible yet unstoppable, moving silently along trade routes and through crowded cities. In 541 AD, the first whispers of what would become known as the Justinian Plague reached Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Eyewitness accounts describe a city transformed overnight, streets deserted, shops shuttered, and the air heavy with the stench of decay. Some wrote that the dead outnumbered the living, bodies piled in public squares before burial could keep pace, the cries of the dying echoing off marble columns and domes. The plague, a strain of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later fuel the Black Death spread with terrifying efficiency, carried by fleas on rats aboard ships that linked Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It spared no one. Merchants, soldiers, nobles, and peasants alike fell prey to its merciless reach. Symptoms were swift and gruesome: fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, and blackened flesh, leading to death in days. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of Constantinople's population shrinking by tens of thousands, the streets empty of life and filled with panic, and the imperial government struggling to maintain order. But Constantinople was only the beginning. From the Mediterranean to the Italian peninsula, from Egypt to Syria, entire regions were engulfed in waves of sickness. Some researchers estimate that the plague killed as much as 40% of the Byzantine population, with ripple effects felt for decades. Economies collapsed as farmers died in the fields, soldiers in the ranks, and artisans in workshops. Famine worsened as labor vanished, compounding the suffering left by the failed harvests of 536 to 539. And yet, the Justinian plague was not simply a medical event, reshaped politics, religion, and society. Emperor Justinian himself narrowly survived, witnessing cities emptied and imperial ambitions curtailed by the relentless march of disease. Religious interpretations proliferated. Some saw the plague as divine punishment, others as a signal of the end times. The psychological terror was as potent as the pathogen itself, fueling paranoia, scapegoating, and social unrest. Trade slowed, armies faltered, and entire civilizations felt the tremor of vulnerability. And while the plague would ebb and flow over the coming decades, striking again and again, its initial wave set a precedent for the fragility of human societies in the face of ecological and microbial forces. In this year, the combination of famine and pestilence revealed a world precariously balanced, a civilization capable of immense achievement, yet utterly at the mercy of nature's cruel hand. But as we follow the spread of the Justinian plague, one question lingers. How did humanity endure the perfect storm of darkness, hunger, and death? And what secrets did the survivors carry into a world forever changed? As the Justinian plague swept through cities and countrysides alike, the very foundations of empires trembled. Constantinople, once a bustling nexus of commerce and power, became a city of silence and suspicion, its grand forums echoing with emptiness, its marketplaces ghostly and abandoned. Beyond the Byzantine capital, the Italian peninsula faced a terrifying convergence of calamities: famine-weakened populations, starving soldiers, and raiding groups exploiting the chaos. Some researchers suggest that the Lombards' incursion into northern Italy during this period was not merely opportunistic, it was fueled by the vulnerability left in the wake of famine and plague. In the east, Persia experienced disruptions in trade and agriculture, its cities struggling to feed and govern populations decimated by disease and starvation. The ripple effect was global, trade networks linking Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa faltered. Caravans abandoned routes, and coastal ports saw ships lying idle in harbors, their crews reduced by sickness. Imperial authorities faced impossible choices. Armies lacked recruits, tax revenues evaporated, and political rivals sensed weakness. For Justinian, the plague was not just a public health crisis, it was a threat to his vision of a reconquered Roman Empire. While he pursued campaigns to reclaim Italy and North Africa, disease eroded both his manpower and morale. Soldiers succumbed faster than enemies could be vanquished, supply lines faltered, and victories turned hollow in the face of relentless mortality. In the provinces, local leaders struggled to maintain order, communities fractured under the pressure of scarcity and fear, and superstitions flourished. Religious leaders interpreted the plague as divine wrath, prompting mass pilgrimages, processions, and calls for repentance, yet these gatherings often accelerated the spread of disease. Meanwhile, rumors and paranoia took root, accusations of poisoning, of conspiracies to summon the plague, fanned distrust between rulers and subjects. Entire cities, like Antioch, were reduced to skeletons of their former selves. Where once bustling streets lay quiet and tombs overflowed with victims. Some historians argue that this period marked a turning point in human civilization, the realization that no empire, no matter how mighty, was immune to the invisible forces of nature. The convergence of famine, disease, and political instability created a shadow over human ambition, a chilling reminder that life, power, and survival could be stripped away in a single season. And yet, amidst the ruins and despair, life persisted. Communities adapted, survivors rebuilt, and the seeds of recovery were quietly sown. But the question remained: how long would the shadow of 536 linger? And what new threats would emerge from the darkness it had cast across the world? In the midst of famine, plague, and sky-darkening ash, the very fabric of society began to fray. Families, once bound by shared work and celebration, faced unthinkable choices: who would eat, who would be left to starve, and who would care for the sick when caretakers themselves were falling ill. Villages shrank as death swept through the young and the old alike, leaving behind ghostly homesteads and abandoned fields. Markets, once filled with the chatter of merchants and the scent of fresh bread, fell silent, and the few who ventured out did so with caution, fear etched on their faces. Social hierarchies, long considered immutable, began to shift. Wealth and status offered little protection against disease or hunger, and peasants, artisans, and nobility alike felt the same cold hand of mortality. Some researchers suggest that the psychological toll of this period was immense. Despair and anxiety became daily companions, and rumors of supernatural wrath spread faster than the plague itself. Religious movements gained traction as people sought explanations and comfort, turning to ascetics, prophets, and ritualistic processions. Temples overflowed with the desperate, yet even divine intercession seemed impotent against a sky that refused sunlight and crops that refused to grow. Others point to an unsettling rise in social unrest. Theft, rebellion, and violence spiked as communities struggled to survive. Traditional bonds of trust weakened, neighbors turned suspicious of one another, and accusations of poisoning or witchcraft became tragically common. In towns like Rome and Constantinople, public spaces that had once been centers of culture and governance became scenes of quiet horror. Cemeteries expanded into fields. Public baths were deserted, and once celebrated festivals were reduced to muted prayers and solitary vigils. Even children, the symbol of continuity and hope, were not spared. Many communities reported alarming drops in birth rates, and orphans roamed city streets, their futures uncertain and bleak. Artists and writers of the time, though few survive, hint at a world stripped of joy and certainty, where light itself seemed to hesitate in the sky. Yet, in this darkness, subtle resilience emerged. Communities adapted to scarcity, shared knowledge of surviving winters, and formed clandestine support networks, planting the seeds of cultural memory and folklore that would endure for generations. From the perspective of history, the societal shockwaves of 536 to 542 AD remind us that civilizations are not just defined by rulers or armies, but by the fragile human threads that hold communities together and how easily they can unravel. And so, from the shadows of fear, despair, and mortality, one question lingers. How did ordinary people endure the darkest days, and what would survive their silent suffering? By 536 AD, the economic heartbeat of the world was faltering, a silent tremor that would ripple across continents. Grain, once the lifeblood of empires, became scarce. Its supply chains, fractured by failed harvests, ash-darkened skies, and unpredictable weather. Ports that had thrived on trade stood nearly empty, their docks cluttered with rotting cargo, abandoned ships, and the occasional desperate sailor clinging to hope. Some researchers believe that the global nature of trade in this period, stretching from Byzantium to Persia, from Scandinavia to North Africa, meant that localized shortages cascaded into systemic crises. Prices soared beyond comprehension, and coins, once symbols of wealth and exchange, became little more than tokens of despair. The common citizen, already weakened by hunger, could no longer afford staples like bread, salt, or olive oil, and hoarding became both a survival tactic and a moral hazard, further inflaming social tensions. Markets that had thrived on vibrant exchange became arenas of suspicion and conflict, with merchants accusing neighbors of sabotage, hoarding, or adulteration. Agricultural laborers abandoned fields that refused to yield crops, leaving fertile land to revert to wilderness. And livestock died in numbers so vast that the air itself carried the stench of decay. In cities, artisans found their craft meaningless. Workshops fell silent, trade guilds disbanded, and luxury goods vanished from public life. Wealthy families, accustomed to influence and stability, discovered that their estates could not shield them from famine or inflation, forcing many to sell lands or flee urban centers in search of safety. Some scholars suggest that the scarcity of resources accelerated the collapse of previously stable economies, pushing communities toward bartering, informal economies, and survivalist networks. In Byzantium, officials struggled to maintain civic order as tax revenues plummeted and civil servants grew unpaid and resentful. Imperial treasuries, already strained by wars and public works, faced impossible dilemmas: feed the people or maintain the army. Meanwhile, in distant lands like Ireland and Northern Europe, where centralized states were weaker, famine led to migrations and clan conflicts that reshaped regional power dynamics for decades. And yet, even amidst scarcity, pockets of resilience appeared. Communities pooled resources, seeds were exchanged secretly, and some merchants adapted by supplying only essential goods, negotiating survival in the shadows of collapse. The economy of 536 AD was not merely faltering. It was convulsing, a global system caught between scarcity and human ingenuity. And as wealth evaporated and trade slowed, one chilling question remained: could civilization itself endure the suffocating grip of hunger and uncertainty? Or was the world teetering on the edge of permanent decline? By 537 AD, the world had entered a new, invisible battleground, one fought not with swords or armies, but with germs and fever. The first signs were subtle: a cough here, a fever there, dismissed as ordinary illness. But soon, entire villages fell silent, their streets empty except for the sick huddled in doorways, the dead abandoned where they fell. Some researchers suggest that the cold and dark of the previous years had weakened human immunity, leaving populations extraordinarily vulnerable. Others believe that trade routes, still attempting to function despite famine and economic collapse, carried contagion across seas and mountains, spreading death like an unseen tide. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, became a theater of horror. Ships arriving from distant ports brought not spices or silk, but sickness. Markets, once bustling, now reeked of fear. Families barricaded themselves indoors. Public gatherings ceased, and the ringing of church bells shifted from celebration to mourning. Historians have pieced together the scale of the plague through fragmented accounts, noting mortality rates that sometimes claimed 1/3 of a city's population within weeks. The symptoms were brutal and indiscriminate: high fever, swollen lymph nodes, blackened sores, delirium, and sudden collapse. Physicians of the time, powerless and bewildered, offered prayers, poultices, and fumigations that did little more than calm the panicked. Rural areas fared no better. Villages, already weakened by famine, faced additional terror as shepherds and farmers succumbed, leaving crops untended and livestock unattended, accelerating the cycle of hunger. Some communities reported seeing entire lineages vanish within months, the silent testimony of death replacing laughter and labor. And yet, amidst the chaos, survival became a strange, calculated game. Families fled cities, sometimes carrying the plague with them. Trade caravans moved cautiously, spreading goods but unknowingly becoming vectors of disease. Religious institutions, attempting to provide solace, were overwhelmed, the rituals of purification and penance failing to halt an enemy they could neither see nor fight. Climate anomalies that began in 536 may have indirectly exacerbated the plague. Scholars suggest creating conditions where rodents and fleas thrived, the likely carriers of disease. Across continents, the human toll was staggering. Byzantium, the Middle East, parts of Europe, and even distant regions of Asia felt the grip of this relentless pandemic. As the years unfolded, the plague would shape societies in ways both immediate and enduring, depopulating towns, shifting political power, and etching fear into the collective memory. And yet, in the shadows of death, the human instinct for adaptation quietly stirred. Communities learned to quarantine, to avoid contact, to survive. But as the plague raged and the dead mounted, one haunting question lingered in every empty street and shuttered home. How long could humanity endure before the darkness claimed all? As 536 turned into 537 and beyond, the invisible grip of famine, cold, and plague began to erode the very fabric of society. Entire towns and cities were emptied, not only by death, but by mass flight, as people abandoned homes in a desperate search for food and warmth. Markets lay desolate, their stalls rotting under grey skies, and trade slowed to a trickle, leaving once thriving regions isolated and struggling to survive. Fear became a constant companion, a tangible presence in streets that echoed with the silence of loss. Families turned inward, distrust festering as rumors of theft, disease, and betrayal spread like wildfire. Some historians suggest that social cohesion, the trust and mutual reliance that had held communities together, collapsed in weeks, replaced by suspicion and panic. In Byzantium, chroniclers describe citizens fleeing the city with whatever they could carry, often leaving behind the sick and elderly to die alone. In villages, neighbors who had once shared labor and harvest now eyed each other warily, the threat of contagion twisting empathy into fear. Psychological stress manifested in strange and tragic ways. Hysteria, delirium, and superstition ran rampant. Priests and monks reported visions, apocalyptic prophecies, and an increase in ritualistic behavior as people sought control over events they could not comprehend. Some turned to scapegoating, blaming outsiders, travelers, or minority groups for the disasters, a pattern repeated across continents. Children went hungry, their small bodies too weak to survive prolonged famine, while parents made impossible choices between food, safety, and family loyalty. The collapse of social order extended to governance. Local officials, overwhelmed by the scale of suffering, abandoned posts, delayed tax collection, and struggled to maintain even the semblance of authority. Armies, once symbols of strength, faced recruitment crises as young men succumbed to disease or fled starvation, leaving borders vulnerable and empires strained. Even the cultural and intellectual life of the time faltered. Schools and universities closed, scholars perished, and manuscripts decayed, their knowledge at risk of being lost. Chroniclers of the era, writing amidst fear and chaos, recorded not just events, but the pervasive atmosphere of dread, the muffled cries, the empty fields, the choking fog of uncertainty that hung over human life. And yet, in this social collapse, some resilience emerged. Communities experimented with new forms of cooperation, informal networks of aid, and primitive quarantine measures, trying to maintain order in the absence of certainty. Still, as winter after winter dragged on and the plague and famine continued their relentless march, one question haunted the living: how would humanity endure the unending shadow of 536? And could society ever reclaim its former strength? Or had the very soul of civilization been shaken to its core? Amid the chilling skies and failing crops of 536, rulers across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia found themselves grappling with crises unlike any their predecessors had faced. Imperial courts, accustomed to managing wealth, armies, and diplomacy, now faced a world unmoored by famine and disease. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian I struggled to maintain authority over distant provinces where communication had slowed to a crawl. Grain shipments from Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, were disrupted, leaving Constantinople vulnerable to food shortages and unrest. Governors reported uprisings in the provinces, often sparked not by rebellion but by desperation. Starving populations took what they could, sometimes clashing violently with tax collectors or soldiers attempting to maintain order. Meanwhile, Justinian's ambitions to restore the glory of Rome collided with the harsh reality of nature. Military campaigns planned to reconquer lost territories had to contend with recruitment shortages and weakened armies. Reports describe soldiers succumbing to malnutrition, cold, and plague before even reaching battlefields. Across the continent, kingdoms previously secure in their borders saw their authority undermined. In Gaul, Frankish leaders faced peasant revolts fueled by hunger, while small communities turned to banditry as survival outweighed loyalty. In the East, the Sassanid Empire contended with its own crop failures, weakening their position against Roman forces and creating a power vacuum that local warlords attempted to exploit. Diplomacy became a high-stakes game. Envoys carried news of famine and plague alongside political demands, with rulers forced to make impossible choices, sacrifice territory, levy heavier taxes, or face revolt. Historians note that in some regions, the speed of political decay matched the rapidity of famine, leading to temporary collapses in governance, local lawlessness, and shifting alliances as communities prioritized survival over fealty. Some chroniclers even suggest that the very idea of kingship and divine right was questioned, as rulers failed to provide security and sustenance. Yet, in these struggles, subtle strategies emerged. Some leaders, like Justinian, invested in public works, fortifying walls, and distributing aid where possible, not purely out of generosity, but as a means of maintaining legitimacy amidst chaos. Still, the overarching pattern was clear: 536, and the years that followed exposed the fragility of political systems, revealing how quickly empires could be destabilized by forces beyond human control. The stage was set not only for famine and disease, but for profound political transformations. Governments, both mighty and minor, were forced into adaptations that would shape the trajectory of medieval Europe and the Near East for decades. And as the empires struggled to hold together, one question loomed over every throne and council chamber: could human authority endure when the very world seemed to conspire against it? As darkness blanketed the skies and famine gnawed at the lands, people across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia turned to their beliefs and rituals for answers, desperate to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. In cities and villages alike, the heavens themselves seemed to signal divine displeasure, and priests, monks, and shamans interpreted the dimmed sun and failing crops as omens. Some chroniclers wrote of processions through towns, incense burning, and prayers offered to ancient gods in hopes of lifting the shadow. In Byzantium, church leaders claimed that the strange atmospheric phenomena were a sign of God's wrath, urging citizens to confess sins and offer penance. In the rural countryside, local customs and folk rituals intertwined with desperation, from offerings of food to the earth to sacrifices intended to appease spirits believed to control harvests and rainfall. In many regions, apocalyptic fears began to take hold. Manuscripts from the time describe rumors of the end of days, as crop failures, plagues, and political instability converged into a terrifying tableau. Monasteries and religious communities became havens, offering spiritual guidance, shelter, and sometimes basic food aid. Though even these sanctuaries were not immune to the hardships of famine and disease, art and literature of the era began reflecting the pervasive gloom. Frescoes depicted suffering populations. Manuscripts featured prayers for divine mercy, and poetry mourned the sunless skies. Some historians suggest that the collective trauma of 536 and the following decades influenced theological debates and shaped early medieval Christianity, reinforcing narratives of divine judgment and human frailty. Elsewhere, in Persia and Central Asia, Zoroastrian priests interpreted natural disasters as cosmic battles between good and evil, urging rulers to perform rituals that symbolically restored cosmic order. Even in distant China, records hint at unusual celestial events interpreted as portents affecting imperial policy and ceremonial practices. Across cultures, people attempted to reclaim a sense of control through ritual, prayer, and symbolic acts, yet these acts also reinforced social hierarchies. Rulers who sponsored ceremonies were seen as intermediaries between humanity and the divine, while those who could not maintain such performances risked being blamed for calamity. The interplay of faith and survival created a unique tapestry of human response, a mirror reflecting both hope and fear. And yet, amid these spiritual efforts, the forces of famine, plague, and climate continued their relentless march, reminding every believer and skeptic alike that human power was fleeting, and the world often obeyed its own laws. What these societies feared most, perhaps, was not the darkness itself, but the uncertainty of what might follow. While chronicles and folklore capture the human experience of 536 AD, the physical evidence tells an equally compelling story. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica reveal a sudden, extraordinary layer of sulfate deposits, the chemical fingerprints of a massive volcanic eruption. This was not a minor event, it was a cataclysm that injected staggering quantities of ash and aerosols into the stratosphere, blanketing the globe in a thin sun-blocking veil. Sunlight was dimmed for months, and some regions experienced drops in temperature that would have been catastrophic for agriculture. Tree ring studies from Europe, North America, and Asia showed drastically reduced growth during this period, reflecting a sharp decline in photosynthesis and growing season length. Even more remarkable is the scale. Multiple independent records indicate that this was not a localized anomaly, but a planetary event. Historians and scientists now piece together a grim scenario: a massive eruption, possibly from Iceland or another northern volcanic region, combined with atmospheric circulation patterns, created a haze that circled the globe. Some researchers believe that this volcanic winter lasted more than a year, though the social consequences reverberated for decades. Crops failed repeatedly, rivers froze in unusual patterns, and famine spread across continents. In China, historical annals note snow falling during harvest months, while in Europe, food scarcity became widespread, and malnutrition weakened populations, leaving them vulnerable to disease. It was a perfect storm of environmental collapse and human fragility, a reminder of how quickly civilization could falter when nature shifted its balance. Interestingly, other geological clues point to multiple eruptions over a short span, suggesting that 536 was not a singular catastrophe but part of a cascade of disasters, each compounding the next. The combination of volcanic aerosols, changing solar radiation, and atmospheric shifts would have created a chilling twilight world. A sky perpetually muted, casting long shadows over fields and cities alike. Modern climate models simulate these conditions and show a dramatic cooling of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius on average, enough to devastate harvests and alter monsoon patterns in Asia. The physical evidence aligns eerily with the written records: famine, displacement, and social unrest. It is a rare convergence of science and history, where ice, soil, and trees corroborate human memory, revealing the terrifying power of natural forces. And yet, even with this knowledge, questions remain. Which volcano triggered the disaster? How many eruptions contributed? And could humanity have mitigated the suffering with more knowledge? The full scope of 536's climatic catastrophe continues to challenge modern researchers, leaving us to wonder how fragile our world can truly be when the skies themselves turn against us. As if the sky's dimming and crops' failure weren't enough, the world in the decades after 536 AD faced an even deadlier threat: the Justinian plague, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. This pandemic would go on to claim millions of lives, reshaping cities, economies, and empires in ways that still echo in history. It began around 541 AD, a mere 5 years after the skies first darkened, suggesting that the environmental collapse of 536 may have helped set the stage. Famine and malnutrition had already weakened populations, and those weakened bodies became easy prey for the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that thrived on rats swarming from disrupted urban centers and trading hubs. Historians describe scenes of empty streets in Constantinople, a city once vibrant and crowded, now echoing with the groans of the dying and the silence of the fearful. Ships that once carried goods and grain became vectors of disease, carrying death across the Mediterranean and into Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Contemporary chronicles tell of bodies left unburied, mass graves dug hastily, and priests overwhelmed, unable to perform last rites. Some accounts suggest mortality rates of 40 to 50% in affected regions, though the true toll may never be known. The plague was insidious, striking suddenly and sparing few. Some families were wiped out entirely, leaving towns depopulated and economies in ruin. Modern genetic analysis confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis in skeletal remains from this period, connecting the historical accounts to scientific evidence. It is chilling to realize that the darkest year was not a single moment, but the beginning of a cascade. First, the volcanic winter, then widespread famine, followed by a plague that decimated the vulnerable. This deadly sequence illustrates how environmental and biological catastrophes can intertwine, creating a perfect storm of human suffering. The Justinian plague also had profound political consequences. Empires struggled to maintain tax revenue and armies were reduced in strength, leaving borders exposed to invasions. Cities once thought impregnable experienced social upheaval and political instability. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Populations began questioning faith, leadership, and the very stability of their world. Could such an interconnected disaster happen again? Some scientists suggest that volcanic activity, climate change, and emerging pathogens might converge in a similar way, though modern medicine and communication make a repeat less deadly. Still, the events following 536 AD stand as a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability. The plague, like the dark sun and failing harvests before it, whispered a lesson: civilization is fragile, and even the strongest empires can be brought low by forces beyond comprehension by the time the Justinian plague had run its first deadly course. The social fabric of much of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia had been irreversibly altered. Cities once bustling with trade, artisans, and scholars were now shadows of themselves. Streets half empty, markets eerily quiet, and temples and halls echoing with a haunting absence. Famine, compounded by years of failed harvests after 536, had already left populations weakened, and the plague swept through these vulnerable communities with terrifying efficiency. Governments struggled to maintain order as tax revenue collapsed. Armies shrank, leaving borders undefended, and rebellions flared in regions where leadership had vanished or been decimated. Historians note that towns like Rome and Constantinople saw mortality on a scale that would have been incomprehensible to their citizens, with tens of thousands dying in a matter of months. The societal impact was profound. Labor shortages gave peasants and commoners unexpected bargaining power in some areas. Yet in others, desperation led to banditry, looting, and the breakdown of social norms. Religious interpretations abounded. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for human sins. Others questioned the gods entirely, sowing uncertainty that eroded faith in established institutions. The psychological toll was immense. Fear of contagion changed behaviors. Families were torn apart, and whole generations vanished, leaving gaps in knowledge, tradition, and leadership. Economically, trade networks faltered, and cities dependent on grain imports faced starvation. In the countryside, abandoned fields and depopulated villages became common sights, signaling not just immediate human suffering, but long-term demographic shifts. Cultural memory preserved these events in chronicles and religious texts, emphasizing the enormity of the crisis, while often attributing it to cosmic or divine causes. Some scholars suggest that the chaos of this period contributed to the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire's influence in certain regions, as weakened cities and populations were more vulnerable to invasions and political upheaval. Meanwhile, in Asia, climate disturbances affected monsoons and river patterns, compounding famine and disease, while in Europe, the Germanic kingdoms that had replaced parts of the Roman Empire faced similar destabilization, struggling to govern effectively amid widespread mortality. The interconnectedness of famine, plague, and societal collapse demonstrates how fragile human systems can be when multiple catastrophes strike in succession. The world of 536 to 550 AD was not just surviving, it was trembling on the edge of collapse. And yet, even amid this turmoil, life persisted. Communities adapted, leaders emerged, and survivors found ways to rebuild, unknowingly setting the stage for centuries of change that would ripple far beyond their own lifetimes. But the scars of this era would linger, shaping politics, economics, and social structures for generations to come. In the shadow of famine, plague, and relentless cold, human societies turned instinctively toward faith, seeking explanations for suffering that seemed unending. Across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, people interpreted the cascading disasters of 536 and the years that followed through the lens of the divine. Churches, monasteries, and temples became both sanctuaries and centers of anxiety, filled with prayers, rituals, and offerings meant to appease gods, saints, or spirits. Some chroniclers described visions, omens, and celestial events, comets, eclipses, and sun-dimmed phenomena as clear signs of divine displeasure. warnings etched into the collective memory of terrified populations. The Justinian plague intensified these beliefs, as the sudden, indiscriminate deaths challenged notions of justice and morality. Clerics preached penance and moral reform, while lay people clung to relics and charms, hoping for protection. In some regions, scapegoating erupted. Minorities, foreigners, and suspected heretics were blamed for the calamities. Accused of poisoning wells or invoking curses, a tragic human response to incomprehensible catastrophe. The arts and literature of the period reflected these anxieties. Illuminated manuscripts, chronicles, and epic poetry recorded suffering with vivid imagery. Empty fields, starving children, empty streets, and silent temples. Symbolism of death and divine judgment pervaded artistic expression, ensuring that the trauma of these years would be carried forward in cultural memory. Some researchers believe that the fear induced by these events accelerated the spread of new religious movements and reinforced hierarchical structures, as people sought stability in a world that seemed otherwise collapsing. Others suggest that this era paradoxically stimulated innovation in medicine, agriculture, and social organization, as societies struggled to respond to challenges that seemed insurmountable. Even oral traditions preserved lessons of resilience, survival, and warning. Stories that would influence folklore, religious ritual, and governance for centuries. Across the Byzantine Empire, in the remnants of Western Europe, and along the Silk Road, memory of the darkest years was encoded not only in writing but in ritual and practice, shaping a worldview in which catastrophe and divine will were inseparable. It was a period in which the fragility of human life became palpable, where the ordinary act of surviving each day became both a spiritual and practical endeavor. And yet, in this crucible of fear and faith, humanity endured. Communities rebuilt, scholars recorded, and traditions were adapted to a reality in which disaster could arrive without warning. But even as life persisted, the shadow of 536 lingered, a reminder that the world could turn against itself in ways that no king, priest, or emperor could fully control. The question remains, how did these shared experiences of terror and survival shape the future of civilization? And what lessons from this darkest year echo into our own times? 536 AD did not end quietly. Its shadows stretched across decades, leaving marks on climate, society, and human consciousness that historians are still unraveling today. Crops failed not only in the immediate years following the mysterious dust veil, but repeatedly throughout the mid-6th century, creating a ripple of famine and malnutrition that weakened populations and made them vulnerable to disease. The Justinian plague, emerging in 541, struck with devastating efficiency, killing millions in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Some researchers estimate that as much as half of the Byzantine Empire's population perished in just a few years, reshaping cities, trade routes, and even military capabilities. Governments struggled to maintain order, and local authorities often had to improvise, relying on ad hoc measures to feed starving people, protect borders, and prevent rebellion. Scholars suggest that the dramatic population decline may have slowed the advance of certain technologies and altered the course of regional power dynamics, leaving some areas depopulated and others more resilient. Beyond the tangible effects, the psychological and cultural imprint of this period was immense. Chroniclers, from Procopius to Michael the Syrian, recorded the year without sun, etching a narrative of fear, uncertainty, and divine judgment into historical memory. These accounts informed future generations, becoming reference points for later famines, plagues, and societal collapses. Anthropologists note that collective memory of such catastrophes shaped social cohesion, ritual practice, and moral frameworks, embedding a cautionary tale about the fragility of human life. Some argue that the hardships of 536 and the subsequent years laid the groundwork for changes in governance, religion, and even migration patterns, as communities adapted to survive in an unpredictable world. Climate scientists, examining ice cores and tree rings, now corroborate textual records, showing a rare and extreme volcanic event as the likely trigger for the global cooling. This fusion of historical and scientific evidence allows us to glimpse how a single climatic event could cascade through the human experience, altering mortality, politics, and belief systems. And yet, amid destruction, life persisted. Societies rebuilt, crops regrew, cities recovered, and empires endured, though forever changed. 536 AD stands as a testament to the resilience and vulnerability of humanity. A year that reminds us how quickly the familiar can become alien, and how the quietest, most invisible forces, like a cloud of dust in the sky, can leave echoes that last centuries. As we look back, we are confronted with the haunting realization that history's darkest moments often arrive without warning, leaving us to wonder, are we ever truly prepared for the next unforeseen catastrophe? Or will humanity once again learn its lessons in the shadow of silence and cold?